In 1970, Motown Records was the most successful black-owned business in America. Berry Gordy's hit factory had produced over 100 top 10 singles in less than a decade. The formula was simple, efficient, and brutally effective. 3-minute love songs with a strong backbeat, happy melodies, and absolutely zero controversy. Artists weren't supposed to ask questions at Motown. They weren't supposed to challenge the system. And they definitely weren't supposed to make protest albums about Vietnam, police brutality, and the environment. But Marvin Gaye was about to break every single rule. This is the story of how one of the greatest albums ever made almost never happened. How a grief-stricken artist went to war with his own record label. How a legendary bass player recorded a masterpiece while drunk on the studio floor. And how an album that was supposed to destroy Marvin Gaye's career instead saved it. This is the story of what's going on. Before 1970, Marvin Gaye was Motown royalty. Born Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. in Washington, D.C., he'd literally married into the Motown family when he wed Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister. He was the label's golden boy, the smooth-voiced crooner who could make teenage girls scream and their mothers swoon. From How Sweet It Is to I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Gaye had perfected the art of romantic soul. He was so good at love songs that people forgot he'd once wanted to be the Black Frank Sinatra, recording jazz standards and show tunes. But by 1970, the man who sang about love was drowning in loss. On March 16, 1970, Tammy Terrell died. She was 24 years old. Terrell had been Gaye's duet partner and closest friend in the business. Together, they'd created some of Motown's most beloved hits. Ain't No Mountain High Enough. You're All I Need to Get By. Your Precious Love. Their chemistry on stage was so electric that rumors constantly swirled about a secret romance. But the truth was simpler and deeper. They were kindred spirits. In October 1967, while performing at a college in Virginia, Terrell collapsed into Gaye's arms mid-song. She'd been diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. For the next 2.5 years, she underwent 8 surgeries. Gaye watched helplessly as his friend deteriorated. She lost her hair. She went blind. Her weight dropped to 93 pounds. She spent her final months in a wheelchair. At her funeral, Gaye delivered the eulogy while You're All I Need to Get By played in the background. According to witnesses, he spoke to her casket as if expecting her to respond. Tammy Terrell's death broke something in Marvin Gaye. He fell into a depression so deep that in 1969, he'd attempted suicide. His marriage to Anna Gordy was crumbling. His cocaine use was spiraling. He'd stopped performing live entirely, claiming he couldn't face audiences anymore. For a while, Gaye retreated into his home studio, producing songs for an obscure Motown vocal group called The Originals. It was the only thing that kept him from completely disappearing. But while Gaye was falling apart, America was burning. The America of 1970 barely resembled the optimistic nation that had danced to early Motown hits. The civil rights movement had been shattered by assassination. Martin Luther King Jr. gunned down in 1968, Malcolm X before him, Robert Kennedy the same year. The dream of peaceful integration had given way to riots, burning cities, and militant black power movements. The Vietnam War had become a nightmare. Every week, planes brought home flag-draped coffins. Every night, television screens showed villages on fire and children running from napalm. Young men, disproportionately black and poor, were being drafted, shipped overseas, and returned in body bags or with psychological wounds that would never heal. In December 1969, Chicago police had killed Black Panther leader Fred Hampton while he slept, shot through the door after being drugged by an FBI informant. It was state-sanctioned murder, and everyone knew it. The country was choking on its own pollution, though few were talking about it yet. Rivers were catching fire. Smog blanketed cities. The first Earth Day wouldn't happen until April 1970, but the environmental crisis was already here. And through all of this, Motown kept churning out love songs. Berry Gordy had built his empire on a simple principle. Motown made music that brought black and white America together. Politics divided people. Controversy hurt sales. His job was to make hits, not statements. When Curtis Mayfield left the Impressions to make socially conscious music, Gordy watched nervously. When Sly Stone started getting weird and political, he dismissed it as a fluke. When his own artists, The Temptations with Cloud 9, Edwin Starr with War, dabbled in protest, he allowed it grudgingly, but only as singles, never albums. But Marvin Gaye was different. Marvin was family. Marvin was a star. And Marvin was about to test Berry Gordy's patience like never before. Marvin Gaye's younger brother Frankie had served 3 years in Vietnam as a radio disc jockey for the armed forces. When he returned home to Washington, D.C. in 1970, he was a different person. the brothers reunited at their childhood home. And Frankie started talking. He talked about the horror he'd witnessed, the death, the destruction, the senselessness of it all. He talked about coming home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge what had happened over there. He talked about fellow veterans who couldn't find jobs, couldn't sleep at night, couldn't escape the war even after leaving the jungle. He talked about feeling like a stranger in his own country. According to Frankie's later memoir, both brothers cried during these conversations. For Marvin, it was a revelation. His own cousin had died serving in Vietnam. Now his brother was telling him that the war was unjust, that young black men were being used as cannon fodder, that the government was lying. In an interview years later, Marvin recalled that moment. When my brother Frankie came home from Vietnam and began telling me stories, my blood started to boil. I knew I had something, an anger, an energy, an artistic point of view. For years, Gaye had been asking himself a question that haunted him. With the world exploding around me, how am I supposed to keep singing love songs? Now he had his answer. He couldn't, not anymore. But Marvin Gaye didn't write What's Going On, at least not alone. The song that would change everything came to him through one of the most unexpected sources in Motown history. On May 15, 1969, Ronaldo "Obi" Benson of the Four Tops was on tour when his bus pulled into Berkeley, California. What he saw outside his window would haunt him. Police were beating anti-war protesters at People's Park. Benson watched in horror as officers in riot gear clubbed unarmed young people, many of them students. The violence was shocking, indiscriminate, brutal. This was the day that would become known as Bloody Thursday. Benson later recalled, "I saw this and started wondering, what was going on? What is happening here?" One question led to another. Why are they sending kids far away from their families overseas? Why are they attacking their own kids in the streets? Back in Detroit, Benson partnered with Motown songwriter Al Cleveland to craft a song about what he'd witnessed. But when he presented it to the Four Tops, his bandmates rejected it immediately. "My partners told me it was a protest song," Benson said later. "I said, no man, it's a love song about love and understanding. I'm not protesting. I want to know what's going on." Dejected, Benson offered the song to Joan Baez. She turned it down too. In 1970, Benson brought the song to Marvin Gaye, and this time something clicked. Gaye listened to the melody and immediately heard something deeper. He took the song home and rewrote it entirely, adding his own melody, his own lyrics, his brother Frankie's story, his grief over Tammy's death, his rage at America's cruelty. Benson later said Gaye added some things that were more ghetto, more natural, which made it seem like a story than a song. "We measured him for the suit and he tailored the hell out of it." When Gaye initially suggested giving the song to another Motown group, the Originals, Benson stopped him. "No," he said. "This is your song." Marvin Gaye titled it, What's Going On. On June 1, 1970, Marvin Gaye entered Hitsville, USA to record What's Going On. He arrived at the studio with an unusual request. He wanted to produce it himself. This was revolutionary at Motown. Berry Gordy's assembly line system meant artists didn't produce their own records. That's what the in-house producers were for. Norman Whitfield, Holland Dozier Holland, Smokey Robinson. Artists sang, producers produced. That was the system. But Gaye insisted. Inspired by his recent work producing the Originals, he'd learned he could be in control. And this song was too personal, too important, to hand over to someone else. He also did something else that broke Motown protocol. He brought in his own musicians to supplement the legendary Funk Brothers house band. He wanted a specific sound, looser, jazzier, more organic than the typical Motown product. To set the right mood in the studio, Gaye provided copious amounts of marijuana. He invited Detroit Lions football players Mel Farr and Lem Barney to hang out during the session, and their casual conversation can be heard in the background of the final track, creating a party atmosphere that contrasts beautifully with the song's serious message. The opening saxophone line was a complete accident. Saxophonist Eli Fontaine was just warming up, goofing around with a riff when Gaye stopped him. "Play that again," he said. Fontaine protested that he was just messing around, but Gaye loved it. "Well, you goof off exquisitely," Gaye told him. "Thank you. You can go home now." But the most legendary moment in the session involved the greatest bass player in Motown history. James Jemerson wasn't scheduled to play on What's Going On. But when Gaye heard the initial bass tracks, he knew something was missing. There was only one person who could give him the feeling he needed. The problem was finding him. James Jamerson was a genius. Ask Paul McCartney, who called him the biggest influence on my bass playing. Ask any musician who understands what he did on tracks like My Girl, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, and countless others. Jamerson didn't just hold down the rhythm. He created melodic counterpoints that turned Motown songs into symphonies. He called his 1962 Fender Precision bass the Funk Machine. He played with only his index finger, a technique he called the hook. His bass lines were so complex, so jazz-influenced, so perfectly in the pocket, that they became the secret ingredient in the Motown sound. James Jamerson was also a serious drinker. He kept a bottle of Metaxa, a Greek brandy, in his bass case at all times. His tolerance was legendary. Motown session musicians said it took a tremendous amount of alcohol to get him drunk. But on the night Marvin Gaye needed him, Jamerson was absolutely hammered. Gaye tracked Jamerson down to a local Detroit bar where he was playing a late-night gig. By the time Gaye arrived, Jamerson had finished performing and was well into celebrating. Gaye practically dragged him out of the club and back to Hitsville, USA. When they got to the studio, Jamerson was so intoxicated he couldn't sit upright on his usual stool. So he laid down on the floor, flat on his back, drunk out of his mind, holding his bass above him while another musician held up the sheet music so he could read it. James Jamerson recorded one of the most iconic bass lines in music history. The line is impossibly smooth, walking jazz figures that weave around the melody without ever stepping on it. It's technically complex but sounds effortless. Most bass players can't play it standing up and sober. Jamerson played it lying down and drunk. When he stumbled home later that night, he told his wife Annie that the song they just recorded was going to be a masterpiece. He was right. When Marvin Gaye played What's Going On for Berry Gordy, he expected enthusiasm, maybe even pride. After all, this was Gordy's brother-in-law, his star artist, presenting him with something special. Instead, Gordy was horrified. "This is the worst thing I've ever heard in my life," he told Gaye. Gordy had specific objections. The song was too political. The production was too jazzy. What was that scatting in the middle like Dizzy Gillespie stuff? It was old-fashioned. The subject matter would alienate white audiences. The whole thing broke every rule of the Motown sound. Years earlier, Gordy had tried to open a jazz record store in Detroit. It failed miserably. The experience had taught him that jazz didn't sell. And this song, with its loose, improvised feel and serious social commentary, felt like commercial suicide. When Motown executive Harry Balk asked Gordy to release the song, Gordy shot him down. The quality control department, the team responsible for vetting every Motown release, turned it down unanimously. They were used to the baby stuff, Balk later said. This was a little hard for them to grasp. Even Gordy's own vacation couldn't escape Marvin's persistence. While relaxing in the Bahamas, Gordy received a phone call from Gaye, who excitedly told him he wanted to record a protest album. "Marvin, don't be ridiculous," Gordy replied. "That's taking things too far." But Marvin Gaye was done compromising. Gaye did something that almost no Motown artist had ever dared. He went on strike. He refused to record another note for Motown until they released What's Going On. Not a single, not a love song, nothing. If Berry Gordy wouldn't let him grow as an artist, then Marvin Gaye was finished as an artist. The standoff lasted months. Gordy thought Gaye would cave. Gaye refused to budge. This was a power play that could have ended careers. Artists didn't challenge Berry Gordy. The label had the lawyers, the contracts, the power. Gaye was risking everything, but he wasn't alone. Harry Balk believed in What's Going On so deeply that he was willing to risk his job. As a Motown executive, he'd seen the company's formula succeed countless times. But he'd also watched as the world changed around them while Motown stayed frozen in 1965. He knew Gaye was right. This song was special. So Balk did something almost unthinkable. He went behind Berry Gordy's back. Working with Motown's vice president of sales, Barney Ailes, Balk secretly pressed 100,000 copies of What's Going On and shipped them to record stores across the country on January 17, 1971. The official release date was January 24th. This was potentially career-ending insubordination. If the song flopped, Balk and Alice would be fired, maybe blacklisted from the industry entirely. But if it succeeded... On January 21, 1971, all 100,000 copies of What's Going On sold out in a single day. Motown received orders for another 100,000 before nightfall. Within a week, they'd sold more than 200,000 copies. It was the fastest-selling single in Motown history. By March, What's Going On was #1 on Billboard's R&B chart, where it stayed for 5 weeks. On the main pop chart, it peaked at #2, blocked from the top spot only by Three Dog Night's Joy to the World and The Temptations' Just My Imagination. The song that Berry Gordy called the worst thing I've ever heard was on its way to selling over 2 million copies. Faced with undeniable success, Gordy did what any shrewd businessman would do. He changed his mind completely and acted like he'd supported it all along. He drove to Marvin Gaye's house with a proposal. "Finish the album," he said. But there was a condition. A bet, actually, because Gordy knew his brother-in-law couldn't resist a wager. Gaye had 30 days to complete and deliver a full album. If he succeeded, he'd win creative control of his music moving forward. If he failed, Gordy kept control. Marvin Gaye had spent months on strike fighting for his artistic vision. He finished the album in 10 days. Between March 4 and March 10, 1971, Marvin Gaye worked with an intensity bordering on obsession. Sessions ran 12 hours at a stretch, often starting at midnight and ending at dawn. Mixes were completed, then redone. Master tapes were flown from Detroit to Los Angeles and back, as Gaye fulfilled an acting commitment while simultaneously completing the album. The album What's Going On wasn't just a collection of songs. It was a song cycle, a concept album where tracks flowed seamlessly into each other without traditional breaks. It was a complete artistic statement. After the title track came What's Happening, Brother? Gaye's tribute to Frankie and all Vietnam veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life. The lyrics painted a picture of homecoming disappointment. "Money is tighter than it's ever been. Can't find no work, can't find no job, my friend. Flying high in the friendly sky." Borrowed United Airlines tagline to create a devastating meditation on heroin addiction, with Gaye singing about the boy who makes slaves out of men. Save the Children was an emotional plea for the next generation, asking who really cares, who's willing to try to save a world that's destined to die. God is Love offered spiritual hope before flowing into Mercy, Mercy Me, The Ecology, one of the first mainstream pop songs to address environmental destruction. "Where did all the blue skies go?" Gaye asked. "Poison is the wind that blows." The album closed with Inner City Blues, Make Me Wanna Holler, a minimalist funk track about urban poverty backed by Bob Babbitt's bass. "Crime is increasing, trigger happy policing. Makes me wanna holler, throw up both my hands." Every track bled into the next, every song built on the last. It was Marvin Gaye's complete vision of America in 1971, the pain, the hope, the question that gave the album its title. What's Going On? Gaye delivered the master tapes with days to spare. Berry Gordy listened to the full album and made one last attempt to convince Gaye it was a mistake. Marvin Gaye refused to change a single note. What's Going On was released on May 21, 1971. The critical reception was rapturous. Rolling Stone's Vince Aletti wrote, "Ambitious personal albums may be a glut on the market elsewhere, but at Motown there's something new. The album as a whole takes precedence, absorbing its own flaws. There are very few performers who could carry a project like this off. I've always admired Marvin Gaye, but I didn't expect that he would be one of them. Guess I seriously underestimated him. It won't happen again." Billboard called it a cross between Curtis Mayfield and that old Motown spell and outdoes anything Gaye's ever done. Commercially, the album was a phenomenon. It peaked at number 6 on the Billboard Pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart, where it stayed for 9 weeks. The album remained on the charts for over a year and sold more than 2 million copies, becoming Motown's best-selling album to date. Mercy, Mercy Me, The Ecology, became the second single, reaching number 4 on the pop chart and number 1 R&B. Inner City Blues followed, hitting number 9 pop and number 1 R&B. Marvin Gaye became the first male solo artist to place 3 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100 from a single album. He was declared Billboard's Trendsetter of the Year. But more importantly, he'd proven that socially conscious music could be commercially successful, that black artists didn't have to choose between artistic integrity and chart success, that Motown could evolve beyond love songs. The album that Berry Gordy called the worst thing I ever heard forced Motown to reconsider everything. Within months, Stevie Wonder was negotiating for complete creative control of his music, leading to his own groundbreaking run of albums in the 1970s. Other artists began pushing boundaries. Years later, Berry Gordy would admit, What's Going On was probably the greatest piece of work that Motown has ever put out. In 1998, What's Going On was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2003, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry, deeming it culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked What's Going On the album at number 6 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. In 2020, they revised that list. This time, musicians, not critics, voted. What's Going On climbed to number 1. It dethroned the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to become the greatest album of all time, according to the artists who knew. The title track has been covered by everyone from Cyndi Lauper to John Legend, from Bono to Chaka Khan. Mercy Mercy Me has been sung by everyone from Boyz II Men to Michael Bolton. The album's influence can be heard in everything from neo-soul to alternative R&B, from D'Angelo to Her. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of What's Going On is how relevant it remains. In 2020, as protests erupted across America following George Floyd's murder, What's Going On surged back up the charts. Young people who weren't born when Marvin Gaye died in 1984 discovered an album that spoke directly to their moment. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. Makes me want to holler the way they do my life. Mercy, mercy me, things ain't what they used to be. The questions Marvin Gaye asked in 1971 remain unanswered in 2025. The environmental destruction he warned about has only accelerated. The police brutality he condemned continues. The veterans struggling to reintegrate haven't found peace. The inner city blues haven't faded. What's going on? What's Going On should have been the beginning of Marvin Gaye's second act as an artist. In many ways, it was. He followed it with Let's Get It On in 1973, another commercial and critical success that proved he could master sensuality as brilliantly as social consciousness. But the darkness that drove him to create What's Going On never left. Gaye's marriage to Anna Gordy officially ended in 1977 after years of bitter separation. His second marriage to Janice Hunter also fell apart. His cocaine addiction worsened. His paranoia grew. He cycled through periods of intense creativity and crippling depression. In 1982, he made a comeback with Sexual Healing, proving he could still create hits. But by 1984, he was broke, addicted, and living with his parents in Los Angeles. On April 1, 1984, one day before Marvin Gaye's 45th birthday, he and his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., got into a violent argument. Frankie Gaye and his wife Irene were next door when they heard the shouting. Marvin Gaye Sr. shot his son twice with a gun Marvin Jr. had given him months earlier for protection. Marvin Gaye died at the hospital shortly after. His funeral was attended by thousands. Stevie Wonder sang. Smokey Robinson delivered the eulogy. The man who asked, "What's going on?" never got to see his magnum opus become the most celebrated album in popular music. What's Going On changed everything. Before Gaye, Motown artists were products. After Gaye, they could be auteurs. Before What's Going On, soul music largely avoided politics. After, it embraced them. Before 1971, concept albums were the domain of white rock bands. After, black artists proved they could create cohesive artistic statements that topped the charts. The album exists in a category all its own. Not just a protest album, not just a soul record, not just a personal statement, but all of these things at once. It's a masterpiece that was recorded by a man who thought he had nothing left to lose, who fought his own record label, who refused to compromise, who risked his career on the belief that he had something important to say. Berry Gordy was wrong. The quality control team was wrong. Everyone who said this album would ruin Marvin Gaye's career was wrong. But one person was right. James Jamerson, drunk on a studio floor, holding his bass in the air, told his wife it would be a masterpiece. Every album has a story. Some are about triumph, some about loss, some about love. This one is about all of those things. But most of all, it's about an artist who refused to stay silent when the world was falling apart. 54 years later, we're still listening. And we're still asking, what's going on?